All right, everyone, let's begin. I want to re-engage with our lectures on biblical poetry, and in particular, where we left off. I think we left off by looking at metaphor and simile, which are figures of speech, but they're, in some ways, they're not just poetic devices, they are ways of formulating reality. And I made that point. I've made it from the outset of the course to some degree by talking about how form and content, or words and meaning, are interrelated, and how the two apprehend reality in some way. And when you get into this discussion, you do get in discussions of theories of language, and there have been various views on this historically, and you can see dialogues dedicated to this as far back as Plato, really. In Plato, the discussion is what the basic form of language is, whether it's a verb or it's a noun. That's in a dialogue by the name of the Cratylus, by the way, Cratylus, which I looked at many years ago now. But the basic position that's been established in Christian thinking, see how that connects to what we said at the outset, the way that Greek language works as opposed to Hebrew language, Greek being more static and Hebrew being more dynamic in the sense that the word is also an event. It suggests an action as well as describing something that is. Not that both can't do that, but there's this just broad-based tendency. When you apprehend reality, the question is, can language even apprehend reality, or do words refer to other words? And is meaning a social construction, which is very common in our day for people to hold that. And that view of language, that words are actually not really apprehending reality, but are, in a sense, pragmatic things that we use like tools, but the tools don't really apprehend anything other than our intentions, but not anything beyond that per se. So they just express us. That view of language is called nominalism, by the way. That words refer to other words, but they don't refer to things. It's a discussion that goes, as I say, it goes way back. It goes back to Augustine as well. He talks about that in his De Doctrina Christiana, which I will discuss next year in our literary theory course, History of Literary Theory. He writes about it in other works as well, but that's one we're going to look at. And that position has been opposed by Christians historically as being incompatible with what we understand by language. So when we say that Jesus is the Logos of God, and that that he himself is the Logos, and that he speaks, and when he speaks he reveals his being, we're saying that there's something of the reality of God which is apprehended through language. So something real is being conveyed there. At the same time, it's not the whole of God. Because if it was the whole of God that was revealed in language, then we would have godlike capacities. In fact, we would be on the same level as God. So something of the truth of God is being apprehended through language, just not the whole of it. And I think I gave this illustration about water, the Lake Ontario water. So this is a cup of horrid coffee. It's wholly Lake Ontario water. That's why it's not good. I'm not sure about that, by the way. But let's say it is, just for the sake of argument. All the water in this is from Lake Ontario, so it's wholly Lake Ontario water. But it's not the whole of Lake Ontario. And yet everything that's in the cup that is water is true of the water that will be in Lake Ontario as well. So in other words, there's nothing about this water which is going to be contradicted by the water in Lake Ontario, which is why I can't drink it, because it's basically toxic, because Lake Ontario is toxic. So as I say, it's a fiction. I'm not being serious. But the coffee's not great. But that I am serious about. So in the same way, when we say that our language of God expresses something that is real and true, that doesn't mean that it is comprehensive. It doesn't comprehend all of the being of God. but it does say true things about God. So when we make these statements and God reveals us to us things about himself in words, we can trust that it's in some ways adequate to what God wants us to understand. At the same time, that allows us to say that God is accommodating himself to us in terms that we can understand, if that makes any sense. Like, how is it possible for finite beings, historical beings, and even worse, fallen beings, to apprehend a holy, transcendental, perfect and holy God? How is that even possible? Well, he accommodates himself to us, and he does so primarily in the form of language, and in particular through things like metaphor and simile, which, as I say, are not, although they are poetic devices, in some ways they're more than that. They're ways of thinking and formulating reality, and ways that are indispensable. So when the poet uses metaphor, he does so because he doesn't have a better way of putting it. It's the best way. So you can't reduce a metaphor to some sort of logical formula. You can't break it down. I mean, metaphors are frustrating, particularly when you start mixing them. But again, God uses those metaphors to reveal something about himself, and you just have to take it that that is the best way of putting it, at least for our understanding. So we recognize that there's a literary aspect to it, that it does reveal something true, and at the same time it doesn't reveal everything that could be known, but it's enough for us to understand who we are, who God is, and how we relate to him, and so forth. So I wanted to introduce that to begin with, and I'll repeat what I said last time. Both metaphor and simile are used because they are vivid and they are concrete, and they are experientially powerful. At the same time, they are not easy to assimilate. You have to wrestle with this. So what does it mean to be the bride of Christ? Like, I'm personally, in a sense, the bride of Christ, but it's never used just individually, it's corporately. So we are the bride of Christ, but how do I think about that as a we? In what sense am I, like you, the bride of Christ? It's strange, particularly if you start thinking about male and female, which you're not supposed to at that point. Although Christ is the bridegroom, we're the bride. Well, in what sense is that true? It can't be literally true. It's ridiculous, but it has to be metaphorically true, and the metaphor has to be saying something profound. And Paul talks about that in Ephesians 5, right at the end, right? This is a metaphor, and it's the best way of describing it. It's one that the Bible consistently uses. So now I'm not talking about biblical poetry, I'm just talking about metaphor in general and how it expresses theological truth. And the most important theological truths are, I think, metaphorical. So this is not vague language, it's precise language, and that's the third point. Metaphors and similes are the most precise. And the only reason we don't recognize that is because postmodern science, we think that the most precise is the language that can be reduced to mathematics and quantification. Whereas these things that we're talking about in metaphor, you can't quantify. There's just no way. It's patently absurd. So on this front, the scholar of language is going to have a superiority to the scholar of number. And I forgot that book. Shoot. It's just reminded me. I will bring it. You can come back after and I'll show you. So having said that, let's look at Psalm 23. I wanted to look at this a little bit. I think I do have it up on the screen behind me. Good. And say a little bit about that in the context of what I have just said, because this really illustrates the dynamics of metaphor. It's a famous psalm. Oh, I don't have it on the screen. Now I do. It's a famous psalm. I'm not going to read it because I assume you know it. It's about the providence of God. The providence of God in relation to the lives of his people. It's obviously directed to David, or at least it's a psalm of David. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd." but it is applied more broadly, not just to David, but also to us. And I would say in some ways it's also going to be a psalm about Christ. So it has these multiple levels that I spoke of at the outset when I talked about typology. It's not just it's not an allegory, it's a type. There's the promise and the fulfillment. So the Lord is a shepherd of sorts, in the same way David is a shepherd, because he literally was a shepherd before he became a king. And then even as a king, he was also a shepherd in a certain sense. And the word shepherd in the Old Testament has connotations of kingship, interestingly, perhaps because of David. But in the sense that a king looks after his flock and feeds them and takes care of them and provides, gives them safe passage, gives them good pasture, etc., etc. But it's a psalm about God's providence in the lives of people. And so security and contentment and resting in this providence, that's what the psalm is all about. What is the approach? Well, it's an affective one, an affect in the sense that it speaks to our emotions. You could put words in there like providence, and you could talk about security and contentment. These are the terms theologians would use, right? And they're not wrong in doing so, but that's not the language that the psalm uses. Yes?
Well, even like in Leviticus, when the Lord lays out the law of what a king should do, the king is a guide, he's not the actual king.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
God is so.
Correct. And initially, if you recall, when the people of Israel asked for a king, the Lord resisted it. Because they would become then like earthly kings, and there would be, in some sense, and then in the end gave them a king, but the king then was a sort of an anticipation of that. That gets into all sorts of issues about what God's original intent was. You know, when he said no, then yes, what's going on here? But we'll leave that aside. Yes?
I've heard it said that the problem arose when they asked for a king like the other nations had, and which is why they have Saul who doesn't actually lead in the same way, where his heart is after the Lord, but his heart is after his own kingdom. And then when they do have a king in the way God intended, is David.
Even Samuel, the seer, and I think there's meant to be an irony here. He looks at Saul and says, there's the guy. He's tall.
Yeah.
Looks like a king.
Taller than everyone.
Taller than everyone. He's a head taller. That's the guy right away. And then he comes along when he sees David, he doesn't spot the king. He's the seer. So there's an irony in the text there. It's never fleshed out, but it's patent. Samuel the seer gets it wrong the first time. But in the second instance, he gets it wrong again, but that is actually God's preferred thing. Now, God's teaching even the seer something about this kingship. And when you say that God's original intent was to have a king, okay, in what sense is the king to serve? Because David is actually a placeholder for the one true king. When he comes, he's not going to be like an earthly king either.
All the good kings are the ones that point the people back towards God as the real ruler.
Well, after Moses, the prophets point people back. All of them point them back to the law of Moses. That, in fact, that's almost the whole point of their ministry, is to acquaint people with God and His rule over them. And here's the way it happens. And so even when Jesus comes, He does the same thing. So it's a very indirect sort of. It's not somebody you're going to see who's your leader. It's the one you can't see who is your leader, and you will obey him, and his scepter is his word. That's actually Calvin's term. The word or the law is his scepter. That's the means by which he rules. So listen to him, and you will be ruled well. Anyway, but so these are pastoral images, and they affect us. They give us certain feelings. I mean, I mocked it last time, but the idea of Jesus holding a little lamb, and we're the lamb, and isn't that cute and cuddly? But lambs are as stupid as can be, and they're helpless, and they're prone to disease, etc., etc. But it is still effective, and if you think about it, and you think about how how weak these animals are and how much a shepherd David himself is, he now thinks of himself, flip it around, the Lord is my shepherd, because I'm weak and helpless and prone to disease and hidden dangers. And he leads me beside still waters, not the sort of waters where a sheep can fall into and drown, which they can do because they're so stupid, right? 'Cause they're not sure-footed like goats. They get caught in the stream, they're going to go down, that's it. But they're still waters, and he restores my soul. So something, and when he says his soul, his inner being, his essential self is restored by these waters. And of course, in Israel, it's often very hot, so water is essential to life. But again, for people that live in that context, the idea of water has a very strong image of life and security. In a way, it doesn't for Canadians. At least in the summer it might, but not in the winter. But we've got lots of lakes, so perhaps less so. We also used to have lots of hydro until the government got involved. But, switch that off. That was a thought, yeah. Yes? Don't ask me about that.
No,
Okay.
no. When you said that this broad-based, the view of language that is referred to as nominalism,
Yes.
is meaning a social construction?
Well, as it was first used, it wasn't. It was just that words are just placeholders, and they could be replaced by some other placeholder.
Right.
And there was nothing essentially true about them. They were just names, but they weren't definitions. And maybe that's a good way of putting it. So the words didn't define the object. So when Adam named the animals, for instance, he just called them this willy-nilly, but he wasn't talking about the properties or the nature of the object. Whereas I think when Adam named things, he understood the nature of what he was calling by that. And that's how biblical names work in general. So when Adam called Eve, he was calling her the mother of all living, because he was describing her nature in some ways. It's not just a name that he liked that sounded good, like the way people name their kids these days after who knows what they name them after.
I'm just wondering, Professor, how they managed to convince themselves of this. Because the idea of meaning being a mere social construction, is that not self-defeating? Because could you not argue that that line of thinking is in itself just a social construction?
Yes, and they might be willing to say that, but there are some substance for it. You'll say that there are differences. Different languages have different names for different things, and that language, as everyone always says to me when I talk about language, apprehending a reality that doesn't change, they say, but language evolves. They get very upset, but language is always evolving, they say. That's been the persistent comment. Language is constantly evolving, which is true in some ways. It's certainly true in terms of slang. Like things that used to be cool then became hot. Right?
Yeah.
And you could talk about, at one point to be gay would be to be happy, and then it became to be attracted to the same sex, and I don't think it's moved away from that, but words can change in their connotations and so forth, right? And they just say that all language is like that, and I don't think that that's true, but that's the debate. So that the nominalists on the one hand and the realists on the other, and in general Christians have held to the realist position because they say the physical objects, the words that we use apprehend something metaphysical, in other words, the definition of the thing. At least when the words are used properly. A false term is a contradiction, and then the word is not that, of course, but we can demonstrate that through logic. That's why logic works. This is true, this is false. But then the science of naming is essential, an important thing. And philosophy, to some degree, is the science of naming. It's naming things the right things.
C.S. Lewis would argue that ruins language. He talked about
Nominalism.
Yeah.
Of course he would.
He talked about how the term gentleman, which used to mean that you own property,
Yes.
you were a lord,
Yes.
became, oh, he's a nice guy.
Yes.
He's polite. He
Yes.
said, anything but usefully, these social engineers have changed the meaning of words. But he argues that ruins language.
Yeah. And there are some things that are clearly conventions, and then there are some things that are not. So there are social conventions. We drive on the right side of the road. In Britain, they drive on the left. So this is the right way to drive. This is the wrong. So some things are conventions. Is everything just a convention, or are some things in the nature of things? Modern language theorists in linguistics will say that everything is words relating to words, at least one school of linguistics. And postmodern literary theories arise out of that, but I'm going to take you into the realm of literary theory rather than the Bible as literature if I go too far down that path. But, and so with that, they come up with gender identity. So somebody can be a male and a female at the same time without any relation between the two. And I talked about that last time, but if you're interested, I do that next year in lit theory. Let me come to the psalm, though. But the main structural principle in the poem is this catalog of God's actions. It really is a catalog. It's a list. A downlog, a catalog. A list downwards of God's acts of provision. There's also the implication of a journey. Sheep are led from their sheepfold to where they're going to graze and rest, and then they go back to the sheepfold at the end of the day. The sheepfold's an enclosure that affords them protection from wild beasts. And the controlling metaphor is that God's care is just like this. But so this is the dominant metaphor. There are other ones that fall under that dominant metaphor. But the first one is that the Lord is the shepherd. Now, as I say, shepherd is almost a synonym for king in the Old Testament. And the motif or the metaphor of kingship is certainly one of the three dominant metaphors used in the whole of the Bible. Kingship or being a shepherd. The other one is the bridegroom and the bride. The other is a ruler in a city. And they are in the Old Testament, and they retain their place in the New. And all three of them are a reference to God, who is our prophet, priest, and king. And they're aspects of Jesus' ministry. So the whole of the Old Testament, the pictures that are being presented there, which are to illustrate how we relate to God, are picked up, and God is, of course, presented in the person of Jesus Christ, who's at the same time fully God. So the central image is that the Lord is my shepherd, and that is he uses the word lens, and I think it's fair enough. It's the lens through which we can contemplate this providence, and that's how we see it. Say the word providence is really abstract, although it helps a little bit if you break it down, call it providence, right? Because he's providing. I can think about providing. The word providence sounds a little bit too intellectual. But if I think about a shepherd feeding his sheep, leading him down the paths of righteousness, again for his name's sake, which is interesting in itself. So he's not doing it for me chiefly. He's doing it for himself. That's an odd thing to say, because at that point the analogy between God, or the Lord more specifically, and the shepherd seems to break down a little bit. Or does it? Does the shepherd look after the sheep because he cares about the sheep, or because the sheep are there to serve him? I think the latter, because he's going to shear them and eat them. Is God going to shear us and eat us? No. So it's not for his belly's sake or his economic necessity. It's for his name's sake. So what's with that then? What does the word name here mean? Well, it's partly revealed by these things called paths of righteousness. So he's going to make us righteous because he's righteous and we are his sheep and he's our shepherd. So there's a moral dynamic to the leading and the shepherding. He's not just looking after us, he's looking after us so that we become, as Leviticus 19:2 says, holy as he is holy. And so the biggest threat is actually to be taken off the path of righteousness, which is what the Psalm 1 speaks of, right? The first wisdom song, being planted by streams of water and so forth. By the way, Psalm 1 is the sort of key for all of the Psalms. It's the introductory one, and it illustrates what all the Psalms are about. There's an implied chronology leading through the day. As I say, it's sort of the journey motif. But for his name's sake, and so his name, well, what is God's name? Well, it's the Lord. And I said last time, the Lord is never, he says, this is my name, and that name, Lord, is the YHWH, which can't be pronounced. So when Moses asked God who his name, what shall I call you? He doesn't answer him, or he does answer him with, I shall be what I shall be. Just like, would you just answer a question? Why doesn't he give him his name? Because he sort of does, but then he sort of doesn't as well. Why doesn't he give him his name? Yes?
Because knowing the name, you have, like, being able to say the name, you have authority over it.
You do. And that's why, as I say, to this day, the Jewish people do not, when they write God, like in English, they write G and a little dash and a D because you can't pronounce the name. But everyone knows that's what's meant there. But that's why. So you can't even pronounce. To pronounce it is to have some sort of power over it. And yet we know what we're talking about. But so there's a reverence there and an awareness of the great potential in the human heart for idolatry, which is thinking that we can master God and he can be a servant for our bidding. That's never the relationship. So that's why, yes, and yes, that's correct. So for his name's sake, but what name? The name of the Holy One. So it's all, no, that's all veiled, or at least it's implied, never rather than stated. But I think if you pull the metaphor out, which I think I said you have to do, you have to interpret it, then it lends itself to clearly be speaking about that. It's not about us feeling safe. At least not first and foremost. It's about us being his people, which if we are, we will be safe. But you can't go for the safety. You have to go for the identity. And then if you are his people, you will be safe because he is God. So even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, what a wonderful line that is. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Your rod is an interesting account. Shepherding, by the way, in ancient Israel, you probably know this, is not like shepherding in Wales or Scotland or probably Canada. It's pretty, the grass is hard to find, and so with the water, and there were wild beasts, there wouldn't be, where I spent 9 years in England, there were no wolves there anymore. They'd been killed off, so no natural predators. The only thing they had is those bovine, whatever it was, when they got the mad cow disease and whatever the equivalents were. But those are real threats, hidden threats, ones that you can't see. But these are here, your rod and your staff. Now, the shepherd there will protect with the rod, presumably, beat them off. The staff is used a little differently, in my understanding. The staff is used with the crook around it, right? And you pull the sheep with it, because if it's a lamb, I don't know if this is accurate, but I think it is so that the ewe will still look after the lamb, because if the shepherd's hands get on the lamb, it will smell different, and the mother might reject the ewe. So you use that as a means of preventing that. Do you know anything about that, anyone? No.
It's like that for like deer and stuff too.
Yeah, so there's a strong sense of sense that identifies this is my particular doe, and this is the fawn, and that you don't want any smell that might put the mother off. So that's why the crook is used there. So again, there's care and concern expressed in that, and again, knowledge of being a shepherd here. But this is the very first. This is an evocative. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Sheep are very nervous animals. And they're not going to lie down if they don't feel safe. They won't do it. In fact, they won't settle at all. They'll keep wandering and they'll bleat and they'll get sick. They won't even sleep out of anxiety. So they have to, and then they get the diseases, and then they get all the, as I say, sheep are infuriating animals. But here he will make me lie down in green pastures. So a sense of calm and security and provision. And note that the provision is not food. They're not eating the grass, they're lying down in it. So it's not primarily a material provision, it's a spiritual provision. There's a security, a sense of peace and protection. They know that it's not that it's not that they're not going to be fed, but he brings them to lie down. So they feel unthreatened. There's no need that they are that is being unfulfilled. So this is an evocative sense, and they're led to not to the water, they're beside the water. It's all there. The food's there, the water's there, but they can rest because they know there will always be food and water. So we're not made for bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So that same sense is being conveyed in this psalm. So there's a sort of an oasis here. It's they come to a shady place, and there's a picture of tranquility here. The restoration of the soul is also an interesting idea. In what sense is a soul restored without eating or drinking? Because your life is given its subsistence by consuming things that keep you alive. But here the restoration happens because of the presence of God. Right? So he makes me lie down, he leads me beside the still waters, but he doesn't let you eat or drink per se, it's just, and he restores my soul. So there's a deeper provision that is happening to David than simply looking after his bodily needs. That's the emphasis here. It's also Jesus' emphasis in the Sermon on the Mount. Same emphasis. He also feeds them. But he's trying to teach them the thing that they most need to feed upon is him. So this is it's fulfilling a universal human longing, and it affects him, the soul, and even our imagination. So this is a psalm that brings us to imagine, or it ought to. And so there's a subtext, and the metaphor pulls us into the subtext, which is, as I say, the metaphor is more literal and more persuasive than any talk about provision could be, or theological abstraction. So there's emotional security, there's spiritual security. But note the translation of "He leads me in the paths of righteousness." The right translation is "in the right paths," so not the wrong paths. So in Jesus' words, the narrow path as opposed to the broad path. Verse 4 pushes it in a different direction. So the first three verses sort of hold together. And then he uses a concessive term, even though, the word though. So this is true, but there is the problem of evil that still persists. So it's not, if you took only the first three, you would think that it was clear, smooth sailing. There's no problems on the horizon. Verse 4 introduces the reality of the fact that there is evil in the world. Not only is there evil in the world, he's going to walk right through it. And furthermore, he's going to have a table in the presence of my enemies. So it's not the enemies will be over there and I'm over here by the still waters. The stillness is going to be right in the midst of the valley of the shadow of death, in the presence of my enemies. The stillness and the sense of God's presence will be right in the presence of the things that are trying to take my life from me, which is a powerful image. I've used this, by the way, in going into very difficult situations. I've prayed that. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, as I walk into a room knowing people have their knives out for me. Not literally. As far as I know. Yes?
Would you be willing to give us just maybe one example of that from your own life? Because I know you've faced persecution.
No.
Oh, okay. That's fine. I just thought I'd ask. I know you've had a rough go.
Sometimes, sure. Yeah. No, I can't think of anything that I would want to.
Okay, that's fine.
But you can imagine the application very easily to any time in your life when you're challenged by circumstances and by people that are hostile towards you. And you're in one of the things, so I'll give you, without being specific, the sense of in a situation of conflict, your worst enemy is actually yourself, in the sense that you can betray your own convictions by responding to evil with evil, for instance, or by getting angry, or by being defensive, or by going whatever, like losing control of yourself. Right? So in that sense, like I don't believe that anyone can harm me because God looks after me, but it's easy in a situation where people are trying to harm you to think that they can. You forget. So let me be self-possessed enough to be aware that God is with me in this situation. I can trust in that, and if I don't know what to say, then I'll be silent, and even I don't even know what's coming, the God will give me the words to speak in that situation. So I'll give an example that I can use then. Going on a culture wars type program, where you don't know whether not only is your opponent going to be hostile to you, which you expect because that's the terms of, maybe the host is going to turn on you, which happens regularly. Who's the neutral party? But what happens if the referee is on the other side, or doesn't know what the other side is and is sympathetic to you but is actually undermining the position without realizing it? How do you operate in that situation? So I think there's all sorts of situations that you could apply that to in family life and work life and in other ones. So I just find this useful in the sense that it's not talking about the opponent is out there. It's the opponent is all around me. Maybe it's your family life which is brought into turmoil because of whatever. Family breakdown, alcohol, other addictions, maybe violence. How can you be in this situation even in the presence of that? Maybe you need to get out of that, by the way. I'm not saying that's not an option as well, but that's what this is about. If you think about all the conflict in David's life, were there that many situations where he was at peace when he was made king? I think his whole life was conflict, at least as far as we can see. And yet he sensed God's restoring power even in the midst of that, even in the presence of his enemies. And he prepares a table for him, before him. Here's a nice phrase as well. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. What does this word comfort me? Like, I'm not thinking, a rod and a staff. The staff, I sort of suggested, okay, that's sort of comforting, it pulls me in. But the rod, comfort me and beat me. It's like, really? Are you a masochist, David? I mean, come on. Like, that's, comfort me some more. Whack. Yes?
I've heard that, like, in ancient times, they'd use their raft, the rod, sometimes to, like, break the sheep's legs if it was, like,
nice.
really going. And
Yeah.
then the shepherd would, like, take it and carry it back to, like,
Oh,
the
thanks.
like,
Can you comfort me a bit more? Crack. I don't know about that. I don't think it goes that literally, although it could, because I don't know enough
That's
about the
really
shepherd.
old.
I mean, that's a pretty extreme situation. So sheep's running away and the wolf's going to eat it, so I'll break its leg, because it's better that it has broken legs than be eaten alive. Okay. True. Well, I'm thinking it more in, and I don't know what the Hebrew word here is, but the word comfort in English means to strengthen. That's literally what because that word fortis in Latin or for in French means the comfort means to strengthen in some ways. So it could literally be, okay, break the legs of the sheep to keep it from, okay, possibly. But I think that that's less likely than that there's a strengthening that goes with discipline. So the sheep are getting, it's not only that he's using the staff to whack the animals, maybe he's whacking the sheep when they keep doing something they're not supposed to, and sheep don't like getting whacked, so they stop doing that. It's a conditioned response. I don't know exactly. But the sense of being strengthened in it is important. And in what sense strengthened? Broken leg, not. That's not. But spiritually strengthened, because this is all about spiritual restoration and providence here, I think. So in that sense, it's being aware that suffering, God uses suffering actually to strengthen us. And uses evil. Remember that God knew that evil would happen. And he is the Lord over it without being the author of it, which is a paradox. God is not the author of evil, but it having happened, God is not handcuffed by evil. He is still able to bring good out of evil. And in fact, he uses evil and suffering in order to comfort and strengthen his people. 2 Corinthians 1, it talks about comforting and suffering, right? So we suffer, but there's also comfort in that, and there's strengthening in going through trials. In fact, God uses those things, and that's as children will discipline, or fathers will discipline their children, so God also disciplines his children. So that sense of comforting. So all of these, the shadow of death and the presence of enemies, these are actually means by which God is blessing us, and the blessing is seen in the anointing, which happens with kings, of course, but it is a sign of blessing. The blessing in the midst of cursing. The knowledge of God's love in the midst of the hatred of the people that oppose God. And because they can't get at God, they're getting you. And his cup not only is filled to the drinking, it's overflowing. Abundance of grace. And he concludes the psalm the same way he began it to some degree. Surely, and with the motif or the metaphor of the journey, God will continue all the days of his life, and furthermore, he will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Forever. So David, who is a mortal man, nonetheless knows that he will never not be with the Lord, because the Lord is living, and if this is his sheep, or he is one of God's people will always be with him. They're not going to be separated from him, because if they were, they wouldn't be the living ones' people. They would be dead, and then they couldn't be his people anymore. So that the greatest spiritual consolation comes in the knowledge that even in the valley of the shadow of death, they're passing through it, and eventually they are going to die. And at the end of the days of his life, he will still be in the presence of God. So there's a time of trial and a time of suffering, but the suffering is a means of blessing us, and the blessing will be an eternal blessing. But all these are metaphors that derive out of this. Any other comments or questions about this?
So, I'm fascinated by what you said earlier about keeping your cool under fire.
Very difficult.
When we go apoplectic, we really have lost it. And look at the tone of this psalm. It doesn't look like that anywhere in here David went apoplectic.
No, but he does lose it in a few points in his life.
In the Psalms, yeah. Like, he feels abandoned, he feels angry, he feels lost.
But he doesn't here because he's aware of his weakness. because he thinks of himself as a sheep, and so nobody gets. They don't puff themselves up with pride when they think of themselves as a sheep. So it's impossible to do. You think, well, these stupid animals. So again, the image is suitable to help him in regarding his true place and true strength. Because remember, David goes on to be, I mean, he's the guy who strikes down Goliath as a little boy, becomes a hero in the life of Israel. They're singing songs about him, and then he becomes the king, the real king, and the great king, the greatest king that Israel ever had. He's, in addition to those things, he also writes psalms, and you know, what a guy he must have been. And yet he was aware that his best moments were when he thought less of himself, or thought of himself less, maybe, and thought more about who he was in relation to God, which is as a sheep. Anointed, the text, Ryken's text reminds us, literally means fattened. The rich, abundant fat oil oozing down. So there's a physical aspect. We would break it down, call it, there's a physical aspect, there's an emotional aspect, there's a spiritual aspect. We would say psychological aspect. All of these are aspects of it. None of these words are used here. Those words that we broke it down, or I broke it down with, are not used there. Physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, they're all presented as one. And so there's a richness to biblical language which we have lost precisely by breaking it down and being more precise. I talked about this in the Lewis Tolkien course as well, that metaphor is a dense form of language. It holds multiple levels together. So you don't gain something by breaking it down and interpreting it. Or you do, but then you don't want it, you have to bring it back into the original unity. So let's break it down. I have broken it down a little bit. A sermon would be different on it, and we'd really get into it. But then at the end of all that, you put it back together and say, but this is the best picture. And we'll stick with that. And you can sing that as a song. And you probably have sung it as a song because it's so famous. Put to some beautiful music. But at the end of this, and this is really interesting, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me. In what sense do these things follow someone? Like, that is itself a sort of a figurative use of language. Is goodness a thing? Is mercy a thing? Let alone a personified thing that will follow him, because this is personification, right? Goodness and mercy as persons that are going after him. Well, God, unless goodness and mercy are God. Remember in Moses leading the people of God out of the promised land, he goes them as a cloud by day and a fiery pillar by night, but he also is before them and behind them. Remember? So they can't get, no one can get near them. He's both, by the way. It's the fiery pillar and the cloud, the dark, thick darkness. They can't see through either during the day. So have you ever thought about that? So the thick dark, they're going forward and they can't see where they're going because there's a thick darkness in front of them. And they're walking around, they can't see where they're going. And at night, they still can't see where they're going because it's a blinding light. But they're walking and they know they're safe because that's God. That if we can't see, nobody else can see. Okay. But that means that we're going in the right direction and nobody can hurt us. But we can't see where we're going. So it's blind trust. Blind trust in the sense that they can't see and they just have to follow the lead. So that is that sense. But here the goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And then in the end, a dwelling. So that's how this metaphor works, I think, in this psalm. And I just think it's just terrific stuff. Comments, questions, observations? Yes?
Something that I noticed, and reading it now, like I spent 5 weeks in Israel last summer.
Uh-huh, that helps a lot.
Well, yeah, reading it now, like reading like the Valley of the Shadow,
Mm-hmm.
having been there, it reminds me of the Wadi system, like the
Mhm.
valleys
Mhm.
in Israel, and they're so deep.
Wadis are like deserts, right?
It's
little
the
mini
valleys.
yeah.
It's like where the water goes. And
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
And so it's like in most of Israel, they're deep valleys. They're not like the rolling.
No, they're
nice
not
little
rolling hill
valleys
type
we
thing.
see here.
Yeah.
It's like literally a V shape.
Yeah, and then
In
the
the
river
middle.
water at the bottom is like a little creek, right? So, or
In
not
the
even
dry
that.
season.
Yeah.
In the wet season, it can come on.
Like a torrent, just suddenly.
Yeah, it happened right before we went.
Right.
A bunch of tourists died.
Died.
Yeah,
Really?
well, it's like because all you
Nice.
hear is the sound of this water, and then you can't see around the corners.
You just hear the rushing sound, like.
Yeah, and the tourists do. But like visualizing it this way, there are so many nooks and crannies in the rock that it's like you can't see what's around them. So like could literally be death around any corner.
Right.
In both seasons, and so it was really interesting to now like have that visual picture of that in relation to this, and just visualizing that.
Yeah.
And seeing truly what like the valleys look like there.
Yeah, I went in '97. That was the one and only time I went, and I found it quite helpful.
Yeah, I went with the seminary
Yeah,
for the course.
yeah, that would be good. Yeah, I just went on my own, but very helpful in visualizing a variety of things. So like the Garden of Gethsemane, and there's Jerusalem right there, but if he goes up the hill, he's gone. Nobody's going to get him. Like Garden of Gethsemane is literally looking right across from Jerusalem, and if he goes over the brow of the hill at the top, it's desert. There's nothing, and nobody's ever going to catch him. He's praying in the garden. He sees his place where he's going to go, but the possibility of escape is easy. No
And you can
chance.
see them coming. You can clearly
Oh,
see
you
them
can
coming.
there you see them coming down the hill and they're coming up the hill. Yep. So every chance of escape is there. Yes.
One thing that I always find interesting is how often the Lord is compared to a shepherd, and like knowing that, like you said, like being a shepherd is very different in like the Middle East compared to the way it is in the West. It's like a very, very dirty job.
It's the lowest occupation as well.
Like,
They're smelly. They're men on their own in the wilderness, right? So yeah.
If you see footage of these men leading like sheep in the traditional way, they've been doing it for thousands of years, and there's giant dust clouds being kicked up, and they are covered in dirt.
Hmm.
Obviously, sheep are not the cleanest of animals, and yeah, it's so interesting to me. Just that God is always compared to the shepherd. He's always, even though he's going to come down, he's going to come down in this dirt, and lead us regardless of.
So it's interesting then. So if the shepherd is the lowliest of occupation, he gets his hands dirty, literally, and he's getting dirty all the time. He's mucking in. When Jesus says that the king is a servant king and he's going to be like that, well, he's getting his hands dirty. He's mucking in. Is that what God's like? Is he also in the midst of all the troubles, or is he out of that? Well, the plain lesson from throughout is that God is in the trouble with us.
And it also highlights the difference between like God and man, because man has spent, like farmers have spent like I said, thousands of years trying to figure out how to make the dirty jobs
A little less dirty.
easier to do, etc.
Sure.
God just accepts that this is the job that needs to be done.
Yeah. And then you transfer that, as we said, to pastoral ministry. There's a lot of dirty work there, and not socially well regarded, and that's difficult as well. The social lack of regard, the poor pay, all of those things, but essential work. Yeah. So all sorts of metaphors that then apply. Let's look at other figures of speech, if you will. So the images and the metaphors and the similes, these are the main means, and they're the means that, as I say, really are not figures of speech so much as ways of thinking about reality, the reality of who God is and who we are in relation to God. So the bread and the wine, not just the or the water referred to in Scripture. Hills are also metaphorical. So I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? What happens on the hills, by the way? Do people think when they lift his eyes to the hills that he thinks of Sound of Music and swirling around? I mean, what do they think? Is that what you think when you think I lift my eyes to the hills? I see Julie Andrews getting around. I've always seen it as when he lifts his eyes to the hills, these are the high places where the idols are. So he looks and he sees the idols all around him, and the idols are threatening him. And where does my help come from? Because I lift my eyes to the hills and I see the images of the other gods all around me. But I don't see my God. And that's really what he's saying there. So hills have a reference to high places where false gods are placed, but those can be made into spiritual, have a spiritual connotation as well. The high places where we set our idols in our minds, where we aspire to greatness or fame, the idols of money or in sex and power, counterfeit gods as Tim Keller calls them, idols of our age. Yes?
It's actually interesting that you mentioned the Sound of Music because
I don't know why I thought of that, but
you know the song Edelweiss from
Yep,
Sound of Music?
I do.
Well, so the significance of that song is in Austria, during the Victorian era leading up to World War I,
Yeah.
mountain soldiers would climb into the hills to show their own glory by picking Edelweiss flower, which
Yeah.
grows in the mountains.
Right.
So it's interesting that you ended up talking about how it's to recognize the glory of other gods, and that song from Sound of Music is all about recognizing one's own glory.
Yeah.
So they're connected.
And of course, so just to make the further bizarre connection now, of course, Hitler was an Austrian, so it all goes to Nazi Germany, so there you go. Right? Yeah. Every analogy has to go to the absurdum ad Hitlerum or whatever it is. Yeah, every good thing can be, and images can be twisted and misused and perverted, right? Sorry, I shouldn't have bothered with that. So these are the backbone of biblical poetry, metaphor and simile, and in general the images that are used. But there are other figures of speech, and they tend to happen with fair frequency, and we'll just look at a few of them. One of them is hyperbole. Now, hyperbole is literally an overshooting. You know how it's spelled anyway, but I'll separate them. So the hyper is over, and the bole is to shoot or to throw. Conscious exaggeration. So intentional exaggeration to have an effect. When you use hyperbole, of course, you don't mean it literally. However, you do mean it in one sense literally, in the sense that it expresses something true about it, and it's usually the emotional truth of something. So the effect on you is being connoted by the use of hyperbole. So just to use the illustrations that I can use, yea, by thee I can crush a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. Does he see himself as Superman? Or is he speaking about the exuberance that comes with being having God present with you? I think the latter. But there's the emotional truth. My tears have been my food day and night. That's a wonderful hyperbole. My tears have been my food day and night. My eye wastes away because of grief. Is his eye literally, is his sight failing? His eye, he's got some sort of eye disease? No, it's grief, and so your eyes are always wet and red, and now it's not just that the tears are coming, your eyes themselves are wasting away. So these are hyperbole. A modern scientist would be saying, does the psalmist, is he describing an eye defect? Then you get an article written in a biblical journal about whether he was describing some sort of, or when David talks about his bowels Did he really have a digestive problem? And maybe it was this. And what digestive problem could he have had in the Middle East and this? Well, if you look at the diet of the apartment, you get all these, it's metaphor, or it's, in this case, hyperbole. It works clearly poetically. If you try and break down what digestive problems David have, I think you've missed the point. But the modern study Bibles will tell you, for those of you who have digestive problems, go to the Psalms or talk. They had digestive problems. Right, it's metaphor. It's not meant to be read that way. So anyway. And again, evangelicals are not just evangelicals. People don't know what to do with figurative language. They just don't know what to do with it, in part because they have this false dichotomy between literal and figurative. The one is expressing the real, and the other is expressing the fictional and not true. And I have said the literal expresses the true, and the figurative expresses the more true. Or more true about something that can't be said literally. That's why you use the metaphor. Or that's why you use the figurative language. It's not to be totally making conjecture and out of touch with reality. That's not how it works. Sometimes, as he says, hyperbole has larger units. So Psalm 18, verses 7 and 8. Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. A scholar might say, see, the Jews were really just like, the worshippers of other ancient peoples. They conceived of God as being angry with nostrils smoking and fire coming out of his mouth, and really they were describing the context of a volcano. And then they applied this experience of a volcano and then just thought about God and the power of God in nature, and then they just abstracted it in a wonderful way. This is just garbage. You have to, again, Scripture has to interpret Scripture, and things can't be in contradiction. You can't make a graven image of God. In fact, you're not supposed to represent God in any way, by any physical thing. Well, what do we do with the language in Scripture where that happens then? Because it has happened. So is the psalmist not guilty of the thing that the Bible forbids? And the answer is clearly no. It's saying something about God. And are we to take this literally then? No. It's clearly meant to illustrate something. And again, the idea that the earth is reeling and rocking, the foundation of the mountains from it, and quaked because he's angry. So whenever there's an earthquake, is God angry? I keep hearing that. I've been brought on Culture Wars programs for that. So there's a hurricane that's happening in Haiti. What do we make of that? Well, it's the wrath of God against the feminists and the homosexuals, right? There we go again. Have you not heard it? Of course you've heard it. It's judgment. It's judgment. It's usually on the people in New York, but it was down in Haiti, so what happened? Well, okay. Well, there's been a lot of, and I'm not discounting this entirely, there's been voodoo in Haiti for however many generations. And Haiti has been particularly blighted by natural disasters. What is with that? Is it an alliance made by rulers of old with Satan? That did happen, by the way, centuries ago. So does that have something to do with it? I think it's possible. But it's really hard to make an exact draw a line. The thing that I always go to on this, when the Tower of Siloam fell on the people. You remember that instance when they talked about this and the tower had fallen on people, and what does Jesus say? Does he say, is it because of what they did or because of their parents or something like that? And he said, he doesn't answer the question. He just said that he doesn't deny that it's judgment on the people. He just says the lesson for you is beware because you're like them. So that's the lesson. The take-home lesson is, did they deserve this or was it somebody else? He doesn't deny that they did deserve it. They did deserve it, and it was a sign of judgment. But the sign of judgment, the takeaway lesson for them is that they should also take heed, because these things can happen, which is what I said when 9/11 happened as well. Is this a sign of judgment on America? Is it a sign of judgment on whatever? Maybe is the answer. Yes, it is. What's the takeaway lesson? America deserves judgment? That's not the way Jesus would put it. It's that judgment is deserved by all people because of sin. And therefore, you need to repent, not just those in New York. There is a sign of judgment there, yes. Anyway, so that here this is a sign of anger and the smoke going from his nostrils. But this is hyperbole. Again, God is not to be personified, and yet he's presented in this way. And it is just personification, and it's also hyperbole. Earthquakes are not literally a sign of the wrath of God. Only. Even more frequent are these exaggerated pictures of the enemies. Be gracious unto me, Psalm 56, 1 and 2. Be gracious to me, O God, for men trample upon me. All day long, evil men oppress me. My enemies trample upon me all day long. Now, are they literally doing what used to happen to me in rugby? And they're putting the boots into you, which is what you can do in a rock or a mall. You ever seen in rugby? Oh, you play rugby. So you get, so you're in the scrum and you're down and you're locked in and you go forward and you're pushing back and forth. Well, what happens if somebody falls down? Because you do fall down. Well, what do? Well, you're supposed to not step on the person, but guess what? If that guy is somebody that you, particularly that is a good player, what are you going to do? Well, you're just going to sort of, oops, and then crunch, 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 and what is that cracking noise? That was the ribs. Oh, that one was a little harder. That was a head. Oops. Then you get away from that, and then they've got the marks of the ruckle, and I don't know how many I came out with these across my face. They don't have the sharp spikes. They got the rounded spikes. You know what I'm talking about, you know? Sorry?
If you wear the cleats on Dave, and
you can get them all scratchy, right, and make them nice and sharp. Yeah. But when you go on the pitch, you have to show your spikes. You haven't done that. Yeah. So was he literally being trampled upon all day long? Yeah. Now you know a bit about him. We've been trampled upon all day long. Is that of course it's hyperbole, but it means that he has been beaten down spiritually, psychologically, personally, whatever. He's been opposed all day long. It's clear hyperbole. Now, there's poetic license. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's not a rugby scrum. Why would we use this? Well, whenever we're trying to be persuasive, we talk in hyperbole. You overstate. It's overstatement. If you don't do what I'm told, I'm going to beat the crap out of you. Do you literally mean that? I mean, maybe sometimes you do, but in general you don't. It's a threat. People say that all the time, right? No? Or maybe you don't. Oops. But 100 things we're going to do, and it's an emotional expression of, I want you to do this. Do this now, or else there's going to be consequences. So it's an emotional expression. Another form, so this is hyperbole. Another is apostrophe. Now, apostrophe is a turn. Apostrophe is a turn away. It's a direct address to someone or something as if it were present. It's usually used in texts in antiquity, and not just biblical texts, as a way of speaking to God. Apostrophe is what it's called. Now, we think of it as just a little comma, right? Often combined with personification. So you can appeal, oh, Zeus. That's apostrophe, and the O is almost giving it away when you do that. That's an apostrophe. And you are speaking of this abstract object or idea or thought as if it were present. It's a sort of heightened speech, and it's full of apostrophes. So, depart from me, all you wicked workers of evil. Lift up your heads, O gates. Have you ever seen heads on gates? No, but he's speaking to the gates. Do the gates answer? That the King of Glory might come in. That's apostrophe, though. You're speaking to a thing as if it could answer. You're personifying it as well. Glorious things of thee are spoken, Zion, city of our God. Of thee, personification, but also apostrophe. You're directly addressing something that can't answer back to you. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Who's being, or what is being spoken to there, by the way? Your own soul. Where is that? You're thinking of yourself. You're not, it's not, who knows where it is? My innermost being. I'm talking to myself. They don't have stream of consciousness. How do you speak to and think of what's going on inside yourself? You speak to yourself. And yourself is your soul, your essential self. Psalm 148, he notes, is a whole catalog of apostrophes. This is not the way we usually talk. I'll see if I can find that here. I know I can.
We did that.
Praise the Lord. All his hosts, sun and the moon, etc., etc. These are just a whole catalog of apostrophes. Expressing emotional excitement, intense excitement. So much so that you're telling things to act as if they were persons. There's an emotional intensity that's being reflected here, and the emotional intensity is also real. Do you not feel strong emotions? Are you going to deny the reality of the emotions? No, you can't deny the reality of the emotions. Well, then how are they expressed? They're expressed through figurative language. I mentioned personification. Let me conclude with that. I think we only have a couple minutes here. This is the way a poet treats something that isn't human as if it were. So you can do it with your cat by talking to the cat and giving the cat a name. My cat's name is Gandalf because he's gray. And I lack imagination, so it's Gandalf the Grey. He was going to be Aslan. My son still is arguing with me about it. He should be Aslan. I don't mind. That's fine. But you can talk about personification not only with animals, which is our common way of doing it. I don't know in the ancient world whether they called their animals by names like that. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. They did?
No, they did. They would create gravestones for their pets.
I know that, but did they call them by a name?
I think so.
Yeah? Okay.
Maybe look it up.
You can look it up. Yeah. Tell me in 2 seconds. The range of personifications is, so how about this one from Psalm 43, verse 3? Send out thy light and thy truth. Let them bring me to thy holy hill. The thy is personification. It's not only is it personification, it's intimate personification. The word thou and thy are intimate forms of addresses, unlike you and your. Those are polite and distant forms. Thy light and thy truth. So light and truth are personified. Jesus says that he's the way and the truth and life. So this is now, think about that. These uses of personification in Old Testament are being made into metaphors in the New Testament. And Jesus himself is the way, the truth, the life, the gate, the bread. These are all metaphors, but they're also, he, the person, is owning the metaphors and saying they apply directly to him. Very interesting. All necessary for a full orbed portrait of who Jesus is. And yet you can start to not only talk about Jesus, you can say he's the light. And light then takes on such a strong identification with Jesus that it's no longer personification. It's almost light really is saying something essential about the nature of God. Yes?
The Greeks didn't really. The Romans did a little bit, but it wasn't common.
Ha!
This is according to the Smithsonian.
There you go. I didn't think so.
They also used a nasty way of picking up. You surround other dog jump in, and she would pick the order.
The one that they liked the best, yeah.
Which one she
Take the strongest one.
would by the merit.
Yeah. That was a savage world.
She was plugging her ears, Jade.
Yeah, I'm not listening to this.
Yeah.
It's over.
Yeah.